You know, it's funny. We've never had more information literally at our fingertips, more analytical tools, certainly more pattern matching with AI and everything.
Right.
And yet, if you actually look at the real world,
Yeah.
societal outcomes, how organizations fail, even personal crises,
Hmm.
sometimes it feels like we're just making catastrophic decisions only faster than ever.
It really does. The speed just amplifies the errors.
Exactly. Which means that grounded, reliable judgment, well, it's more critical than ever, isn't it?
It's the ultimate paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
The paradox of plenty. We are like drowning in data, but somehow starved for actual wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
And as more decisions get automated or just made at internet speed,
Yeah.
the mental models underneath, the schema we use to fit to reality, they have to be absolutely sound.
Because if the model's flawed,
Right. If your underlying model is off, then AI just helps you execute a flawed strategy faster and maybe at a massive scale, which is terrifying.
yeah, truly. Well, welcome everyone to this deep dive into the ideas that make for better judgment. This comes from Poor Ash's Almanac, produced by Ascalon Capital.
And today, we're really wrestling with a fundamental tension. It shapes everything, from how you might think about investing to social policies, that interplay of nature versus nurture.
And specifically, what happens when we kind of abandon that complex interplay, maybe in favor of ideologies that serve us but aren't really grounded, what the source material calls luxury beliefs.
Yeah, and our sources today,
Yeah.
they really push us to step away from that tired, simplistic debate. Nature or nurture, it's not that.
No.
They present it as this complex dynamic system. You've got biological bounds, you've got environmental feedback loops, and then you have individual agencies sort of operating within all of that.
So our mission today is really to unpack that central idea. How does biology set the foundational base rate distribution? What's possible for a population? Then how do culture and environment steer how that potential gets expressed?
And crucially, what happens when ideology gets in the way? When it creates an inaccurate, maybe even damaging schema of reality that just makes us terrible decision makers.
So let's start there. How do we even figure out what those biological bounds are?
Okay, so to start, we really have to define what we mean by nature in this context. And primarily, we're talking about two things: hard bounds and probabilistic limits. Biology sets the ultimate ceiling on what's possible.
Right. The hard bound is easy. We get that. Humans can't fly without, a plane or something. That's a non-probabilistic certainty.
Exactly.
But most of the bounds that really matter for human behavior, for society, they're probabilistic, aren't they? They're not certainties.
That's the key. If you're trying to predict human outcomes, whether it's, the success of a sports team or the stability of a community, you have to respect that foundational base rate, the population-level distribution of potential.
Okay.
And the really critical intellectual move here, I think, is to get beyond the simplification that, a gene equals destiny. This doesn't work that way.
No.
Sam Keen, in his book, The Violinist's Thumb, great book. By the way, he puts it perfectly. Genes deal in probabilities, not certainties.
Probabilities, not certainties. I like that.
Yeah. They set the likelihood, the tendency, maybe the potential, but not the rigid outcome.
Okay, so how significant are these probabilities then? Where do we see this base rate concept really clearly in action?
Well, a classic example is the schizophrenia twin study. If you look at the general population, the base rate for developing schizophrenia is what, about 1%?
Right.
Pretty low.
Right.
But if one identical twin develops the same genes, remember the other twin has something like a 30 to 50% chance of also developing it.
Wow. Okay, so that's 30 to 50 times higher than the base rate. That's a huge genetic signal.
It's a clear genetic base rate, absolutely. But here's the kicker, and this is where nurture becomes profoundly important. It's the gap.
The gap.
Yeah, the 50 to 70% difference. Because half the time, or more, the genetically identical twin doesn't develop the disorder.
Ah, okay, so that remaining percentage.
Yeah.
That's the space where nurture operates.
Exactly. That differential is the nurture space. And again, we're defining nurture really broadly here: the environment, parents, peers, the culture you're in, and really importantly, individual agency.
Yeah.
Your choices.
Mm-hmm.
If it were purely deterministic, purely genetic, that gap would be zero, right? Both twins would always get it, or neither.
That's a fascinating way to think about human agency then. It's sort of
Yeah.
the percentage difference between the raw genetic potential and what actually happens.
You could look at it that way. And you see this play out elsewhere, too. You can clone the blueprint, the genes, but you can't clone the life experience that shapes it.
Like the cloned pets example.
Exactly. The source mentions people like Barbara Streisand cloning beloved pets. And they reported that the genetic copies, well, they had wildly different personalities. Clive Wynne sums it up really profoundly in his book, Dog is Love. He says, you can't clone the soul.
You can't clone the soul. Wow.
The environment, the nurture, it shapes that potential into the actual realized personality. And that's such a crucial grounding principle for any kind of human judgment, I think. You have to respect the base rate nature sets, but you also have to acknowledge the incredible shaping power of nurture.
And it makes you think about AI, too, doesn't it? As we rely more on these predictive models, especially ones built on huge data sets looking for base rates, understanding that nurture input, that non-replicable experience, maybe that's what keeps us from falling into purely deterministic thinking. It reminds us, correlation isn't causation, and every individual is kind of operating in that 50 to 70% gap you talked about.
Precisely. Human judgment has to account for that gap. AI might spot the base rate pattern, but understanding the why behind the individual deviations often requires understanding the nurture context.
Okay, let's pivot a bit. Let's talk about a key area where this tension, biological base rates versus environmental steering, is maybe most visible and often most contentious. That's sexual dimorphism, and specifically the influence of hormones like testosterone.
Yeah, this is where the source material draws heavily on Carol Hooven's book, T, The Story of Testosterone. And it's really essential reading, I think.
Why essential?
Because it cuts through a lot of the denial that sometimes surrounds hormones. Hooven argues really clearly that while humans were certainly not puppets controlled by our genes or hormones, we absolutely experience their profound shaping influence.
Yeah.
You can't just wish it away because it's inconvenient.
And there's a really interesting flip here in her argument about control, isn't there? It's not that testosterone controls us, but that the more we understand these powerful biological influences, the more control we actually gain over how we behave.
Exactly. Ignorance isn't bliss here. Ignorance of the base rate of these underlying tendencies is just a recipe for chaos, personally and maybe societally. So she makes the point that certain underlying male tendencies, maybe things like aggression, dominance-seeking behavior, some forms of risk-taking, these seem to precede culture. They exist partly because of the biological organization driven by testosterone, especially during development.
But crucially,
culture and environment are the really powerful tools we have to channel those tendencies, to steer them. They provide the environmental brake, if you like.
The environmental brake. I like that term. It makes it tangible. And Rob Henderson's memoir, Troubled, gives us a pretty stark, real-world example of what happens when that brake is missing and then what an intentional structural brake can look like.
Yeah, his description of the military is fascinating in this light. He basically describes it as this massive, coordinated exercise in structural problem solving, specifically for young men.
How so?
Well, he says it's, quote, designed to keep young men too busy and too exhausted to get into trouble. It's this ultimate external structured environment. It's like a societal mechanism designed specifically to contain and ideally productively channel the very impulses that dominance drive. The need for physical exertion, maybe the risk-taking. They're most likely to derail young men during their, statistically speaking, riskiest years.
So the military structure respects the biological base rate.
Yes.
By providing a framework, a nurture framework, to manage it effectively.
Exactly. And if you deny that base rate, if you pretend all these behaviors are just purely social constructs, completely classic, then you can't design effective brakes like the military. Or maybe you design really ineffective ones that just ignore the underlying energy instead of channeling it.
Which brings us to childhood. How does that energy manifest early on?
Well, Hooven highlights play preferences. She calls the difference in play styles perhaps the biggest difference consistently found between young boys and young girls across cultures.
And that difference is?
Rough and tumble play. It's found everywhere, all cultures across the planet. The data cited in the source, it's pretty startling. Boys pushed, pulled, or hit their play partners something like 6 times more often than girls did in observed play settings.
6 times. That's not a small difference. That feels like a fundamental difference in a behavioral base rate.
It's significant. And Hooven notes the parallels are striking in animal models, too. Juvenile male rats, monkeys, dogs, they all engage in this kind of intense physical play. It often mirrors the sort of Mortal Kombat fantasy world she observed her own son creating. It seems to be this deeply ingrained, biologically conserved drive, and it burns a lot of energy.
Okay, so if it's conserved, if it uses energy, there must be an evolutionary purpose, right? It can't just be frivolous.
Exactly. This is where we need to think about proximate versus ultimate explanations.
Okay.
The proximate explanation is, well, it's fun, it burns off energy, it builds social bonds maybe.
Sure.
But the ultimate evolutionary purpose, Hooven suggests, is that this is critical training for what she calls the dominance arena.
Oh, dominance arena.
Yeah, it's practice. Practice for negotiating force, learning to regulate aggression, establishing social hierarchy skills that, frankly, for most of human history, were directly linked to accessing resources and reproductive opportunities. It wasn't frivolous. It was essential practice.
And what happens when that drive isn't channeled constructively, when there isn't a safe arena for that practice?
Well, then it can get expressed chaotically, or as Henderson describes it from his experience, often aggressively.
Right, his descriptions of the foster care system.
It's a textbook case, really, a chaotic environment, a failure of nurture, allowing that underlying nature to express itself in a really destructive way. For those kids, constantly moving, fighting wasn't just play. He says it was a social necessity. You had to constantly reestablish the pecking order to avoid being seen as weak as a target.
And that adaptation, learning to be emotionally closed off and aggressive just to survive, it must have caused deep damage later on.
Oh, absolutely. That's what the source material calls trait adaptivity. The behavior shutting down emotionally, seeking confrontation. It was perfectly adaptive for survival in that specific chaotic environment. But it created these deep, persistent, brick-like effects.
Brick-like effects.
Meaning deeply ingrained habits, behavioral patterns, emotional schemas that stick with you long after the environment that required them has changed, and they end up harming you when you move into more stable, normal settings. The adaptation becomes a liability.
That makes sense. And, for anyone still holding on to a purely cultural explanation, a blank slate theory for these kinds of behavioral differences, the data on congenital adrenal hyperplasia, CAH, seems really important here.
It's scientifically unequivocal, really. It's powerful proof that biology sets an organizational base rate. CAH is a genetic condition, right? The adrenal glands malfunction, and they produce high levels of androgens, like testosterone, before birth.
Okay.
So you have genetic females, XX chromosomes, exposed to these high androgen levels in the womb, but they're raised culturally as girls.
So if socialization was the only factor?
They should develop play preferences exactly like their unaffected peers.
Right. But they don't.
Not at all. Studies show CAH girls spent significantly less time with typical girls' toys. Maybe only 21% of their playtime. And a huge chunk, 44%, with typical boys' toys. Their overall play styles, their behavioral preferences were described as much more masculinized.
So that prenatal hormone exposure, it wasn't just physical. It literally organized the brain differently.
That's the argument. It creates a predisposition, a kind of brick-like effect in the brain's wiring, favoring certain behaviors and interests over others. It strongly suggests the brain is definitively not a gender-neutral blank slate at birth.
Wow.
And understanding that biological organization, that base rate difference, is really the only way you can then design effective nurture strategies, effective environmental breaks later on. You have to know what you're working with.
Okay, so we've talked about these brick-like effects, the kind of fixed biological organization. But let's shift now to the more dynamic relationship. Biology isn't static, right? It's this constant feedback loop between nature and nurture.
Exactly. We need to think about organization, the underlying genetic potential versus activation. How experience actually brings out that potential and maintains it.
Organization versus activation.
Okay, Wynn's work on dogs, which you mentioned earlier, gives us a really clear, easy-to-grasp analogy for this.
The hypersociability thing.
Yeah. Dogs seem to have the genetic potential for hypersociability, this innate desire and ability to bond deeply with humans. But, and this is key, that potential is incredibly time-sensitive.
It needs a trigger from the environment.
Right. That potential for bonding must be activated by positive human exposure during a critical window, roughly the first 14 weeks of a puppy's life.
And if it's not?
Wynn argues it's essentially lost forever. Puppies kept in isolation past that point become, in his words, essentially untamable. They never developed that deep social bond. The potential was there, but the environment didn't activate it in time.
So the cage, or the lack of a cage in this case, the environment, determines if the genetic potential ever gets realized. Organization is basically useless without timely activation.
Precisely. And this principle applies directly to us, to the chemicals in our own bodies. Take testosterone again. The levels aren't just some static number stamped on you at birth.
No.
No, they're dynamically regulated by the environment. There's a mechanism often called the challenge hypothesis.
Okay, the challenge hypothesis. What's that?
It's fascinating. Basically, T levels tend to rise in response to status challenges, threats to resources, competition. We see it in animals like sparrows fighting over territory. Their T levels go up.
And in humans?
We see it in humans, too. Hooven cites that famous study, the winner-loser effect. Remember the 1994 World Cup final? Italy versus Brazil?
Vaguely, yeah.
They measured the testosterone levels of male fans right after the game. The losing Italian fans, their T levels dropped significantly.
Seriously.
Yep. While the winning Brazilian fans' T levels either stayed stable or even increased a bit.
Wow. So losing a game literally lowered their testosterone. That's not just being a sore loser then.
No. It's likely an adaptive system. Think about it. If you lose a status challenge, biologically speaking, continued high confidence and aggression might be a really bad survival strategy, right?
Yeah, probably time to back off.
Exactly. So the hormonal change might enforce a behavioral adjustment, maybe more caution, retreat, time to reassess. It could increase your long-term survival probability. It's like this brilliant built-in system design.
That has huge implications for judgment, doesn't it? If we ignore that kind of feedback, say in business or investing, we keep pouring resources into an aggressive strategy that's clearly failing. We're essentially fighting our own biology.
You could argue that, yeah. A stable environment tends to encourage more stable T levels. Chaotic, challenging environments might encourage more volatile, maybe riskier fluctuations. The environment is constantly talking to our hormones.
And there's another layer to this feedback too, right? A sort of biological off switch that promotes long-term stability.
Yes, absolutely. Testosterone levels also tend to drop in men when they enter a stable romantic pair bond and become involved in caring for their offspring.
Really? How significant is that?
The anthropological data is quite strong. The source mentions the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. Fathers among the Hadza had, on average, about 50% lower T levels than childless men of the same age in their group.
50% lower. Wow.
Hooven calls it brilliant evolutionary design. Lower T might help direct attention away from seeking new mates or competing with rivals and towards family stability, investing in children, cooperation. It underpins that stable family environment, the very nurture factor that seems so critical for positive outcomes.
Okay, so we have these fast feedback loops, a soccer game, having a child. But the source material says this loop also operates over much deeper evolutionary time, right? Gene culture co-evolution.
Exactly. Marlene Zook's work is really important here. She helps dismantle what she calls the paleo fantasy, this popular idea that human evolution just sort of stopped 10,000 years ago with the dawn of agriculture.
Which isn't true.
Not at all. In reality, Zook and others argue that culture has actually accelerated human evolution in many ways. Culture creates the selective environment, the niche, that our biology then adapts to.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Dairy farming is a classic one. The cultural practice of raising cattle for milk created strong selective pressure favoring individuals who happen to have a mutation, allowing them to digest lactose, the sugar in milk, into adulthood. That led to the spread of the lactase persistence mutation in populations with a history of dairying.
So a cultural invention, dairy farming, literally changed our biology.
Yep. Adult humans being able to digest milk is a relatively recent evolutionary development, driven entirely by culture. Or look at grain agriculture.
Okay.
The cultural practice of eating high-starch diets seems to have favored individuals who had more copies of a gene called AMY1, which helps produce salivary amylase, an enzyme that breaks down starch.
So our diets shaped our genes.
Our cultural choices about diet created the pressure. We are constantly co-evolving with our choices, with our culture. It's a feedback loop across millennia.
Okay, this is getting complex. So it's not just genes, it's not just environment, it's this dynamic interplay over time. And you're saying it's even more complex when we think about specific outcomes, like aggression.
Yes, we absolutely have to consider multi-causality, especially here. Aggression isn't just about how much testosterone is floating around. That's way too simplistic.
Right.
It seems to be more like an equation, involving at least 3 critical variables interacting.
Okay, what are they?
First, the amount of T. Second, the individual's underlying personality. And third, the efficiency of the testosterone receptors in their body.
So T times personality times receptor sensitivity.
Something like that.
Yeah.
First, personality matters. Some research suggests T only significantly increases aggression in men who are already rated as highly dominance-oriented or maybe impulsive to begin with. In others, it might not have the same effect.
Okay, context matters.
Context and predisposition. Second, receptor efficiency. This is partly genetic. It can be measured by things like the number of CAG repeats in the androgen receptor gene. Fewer repeats generally means a more sensitive or efficient receptor. Meaning the exact same amount of T floating in the bloodstream can produce a much bigger downstream response, maybe a bigger aggressive response in one person compared to another, just because their receptors are more sensitive.
Wow. Okay, that complexity. That really is the core challenge for human judgment, isn't it? Especially now with AI that loves simple correlations.
Exactly. AI might find a correlation between T levels and aggression in a data set, but it might miss the crucial mediating roles of personality and receptor sensitivity unless it's specifically programmed to look for them.
So if we're trying to predict behavior, whether it's in society, in markets, politics, whatever, we have to account for these multiple interacting variables. A simplified single-cause model, whether it's blaming everything on deterministic biology or purely environmental socialization. It's just guaranteed to be wrong, isn't it?
It ignores the multiplying effects. It ignores the reality of the system. You have to embrace the complexity.
Which brings us back to Rob Henderson's story, because this incredible, complex, dynamic system you're describing, well, his early life seems like a case study in what happens when the nurture side of that equation fails spectacularly.
It really is. His childhood provides this almost perfect, albeit tragic, illustration of environmental chaos. And it connects directly to the work of Johann Hari, particularly on addiction and attention.
How so? The rat park connection.
Exactly. Hari popularized the rat park experiment in his book, Chasing the Scream. And while there's been some debate about replicating the original study exactly, the core metaphor is incredibly powerful.
Remind us of the metaphor.
Well, the traditional view of addiction, based on earlier experiments, was basically just a chemical hook. You put a rat in a standard, empty lab cage, give it access to drug-laced water, and it self-administers until it potentially overdoses. Addiction equals chemical dependency.
Right.
But Rat Park offered the rats a very different environment. A large, socially rich, stimulating park with other rats, things to do, places to explore. And in that environment, the rats mostly ignored the drug-laced water, even though it was freely available.
So addiction wasn't just the chemical.
It suggested addiction is, perhaps more fundamentally, an adaptation. A painful coping mechanism for being stuck in a cage of isolation, trauma, powerlessness, lack of connection, not just a chemical hijacking of the brain.
And Henderson's behaviors as a kid, the constant thrill-seeking, starting to drink at age 9, you see those as his version of being stuck in a cage.
You could argue that, yeah. It maps onto another analogy Hari uses in his book Stolen Focus, the zoo animal analogy.
The pacing polar bear.
Exactly. The pacing polar bears, the horses that cribite their stalls. Hari argues they suffer from, quote, frustrated biological objectives. They're in an environment where they simply cannot express their innate nature in a healthy, adaptive way.
So Henderson's chaos, it wasn't just random bad behavior. It was maybe his rational, adaptive distress signal. A kid stuck in a human zoo of neglect, instability, unpredictability.
His behaviors, however destructive they seem from the outside, might have been his desperate, albeit often harmful, attempts to assert some kind of agency, to feel something other than constant pain and fear in that environment.
And this connects to Hari's other work, too, on depression, right, and lost connections.
Yes. He makes a compelling argument that depression isn't always just a chemical imbalance in the brain, treatable solely with medication. Often, he argues, it's a perfectly rational response to profound pain. Meaning, if we accept that profound grief is a normal, rational response to losing a loved one, why wouldn't deep depression be a similarly rational, understandable response to losing the life you expected? Or maybe grieving the stable, loving childhood you never had?
So Henderson's depression, his emotional shutdown, it could be seen as this deep, maybe unresolved grief for the stable family structure he craved but never experienced.
The constant pain and instability taught him, adaptively perhaps, never to get attached, never to trust. And his later relentless pursuit of education, of structure, that becomes his ultimate act of agency, an attempt to build a reliable park for himself and maybe for the family he hoped to create.
It's powerful. And we see a similar kind of nurture failure, maybe on a broader scale, reflected in what people call the modern childhood attention crisis.
Absolutely. The diagnosis rates for ADHD, they've just climbed relentlessly, especially for boys, reaching double digits in some demographics.
And the standard narrative is often
quite simplistic. It's a problem with his brain. Genetics play a big role, maybe 75–80%. And the primary solution offered is medication, positioned as a management tool.
But that might be missing the bigger picture.
Well, critics like Dr. Sami Tamimi argue that the ADHD label itself is just a description of behavior. It's not the underlying cause. It should be the beginning of the investigation, not the end.
An investigation into what?
Into the context, into the environment. Hari notes that when clinicians really dig into a child's life, the school environment, the family dynamics, their diet, their sleep, often the symptoms described as ADHD, diminish or even vanish when the environmental stressors are addressed. A better school fit, more parental support, more time for unstructured play.
And we also have to look at the internal environment, don't we?
Crucial point. The internal environment feeds this attention crisis loop too. Things like poor sleep, chronic stress, maybe diets high in processed foods. They can create this state of constant low-grade fight-or-flight activation. And our ability to pay sustained attention is often the first casualty of that internal distress. It fragments focus, reinforcing the feeling of being trapped or overwhelmed, the internal cage.
Is there evidence for that internal environment link?
Oh, yeah. The source material mentions a notable Dutch study looking at elimination diets. They took kids with focus issues, put them on a special diet free of common triggers like synthetic additives.
Yeah.
The results were described as remarkable. Over 70% of the children showed significant improvements in their ability to pay attention just from changing their diet.
Wow. 70%. That's huge. It clearly shows the body's internal state powerfully influences the brain's ability to focus.
Undeniably.
Yeah.
And let's bring Carol Hooven's T research back in here one last time. Remember the rough and tumble play?
Yeah, the critical training for regulating force and dominance.
Right, not just burning off energy, but essential developmental training. Now think about modern childhood environments. We've increasingly taken these biologically wired, naturally rambunctious kids, especially boys, and put them into settings that often ban physical contact, eliminate unstructured free play.
We've removed the park.
We've removed the designated safe space for them to channel that base rate energy constructively. This is what Hari and others call the collapse of free play.
And that energy has to go somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if it can't go into rough play or climbing trees, maybe it comes out as fidgeting in class, disruptive behavior, which then leads down the path toward an ADHD diagnosis and medication.
Whereas Henderson found his own antidote, didn't he? The boxing gym.
The boxing gym. It's the perfect counterpoint. It was his version of the park, a structured, physically demanding environment that channeled that same energy constructively instead of just suppressing it.
What was it about the gym that worked? What were the mechanics?
Well, thinking about it, the gym seems to have provided at least 4 crucial things, addressing both his nature and his nurture deficit.
Right.
1, mentorship from the coaches. 2, clear, tangible signs of progress as he got stronger and better. 3, a very clear social hierarchy based on skill and discipline, not just random aggression. And 4, a sense of earned belonging within that structure.
So it respected his underlying nature, the need for a physical challenge, maybe the dominance drive, dealing with aggression, but it provided the nurture, the structure, the rules to tame it and make it productive.
Precisely. He wasn't allowed to just lash out randomly. He had to train, follow the rules, respect his opponents, earn his status. It taught him discipline. It helped him, as he describes it, dismantle that internal cage built by trauma piece by piece and build the stability he'd always craved.
Okay, so this failure, this systemic failure maybe, to properly integrate a sound understanding of both nature and nurture. This brings us to what might be the most sort of pointed concept in the source material, the luxury belief mental model.
Yeah, coined by Rob Henderson himself, based on his experiences. This is where ideology seems to actively distort reality, often with harmful consequences.
So define a luxury belief for us.
A luxury belief is essentially an idea or an opinion that confers social status, prestige on members of the upper or affluent class,
Okay.
while simultaneously inflicting real-world tangible harm on the vulnerable, the working class, or society more broadly. It's like virtue signaling, but where the cost of the signal is completely externalized onto others.
The believer gets the social reward. They feel sophisticated, virtuous, maybe rebellious.
Right, they get the status boost, but they remain totally insulated from the negative downstream consequences of the belief itself.
And Henderson really saw this firsthand when he arrived at Yale, right? That schema gap you mentioned earlier.
It was a profound shock for him. He had lived through the direct, often violent consequences of social breakdown, family instability, poverty, and then he encountered these affluent classmates who seemed to have the safety net, the house money, as the source puts it, to afford holding on to what he saw as these incredibly destructive, fashionable ideologies.
And the statistics he encountered there really highlight this gap.
Devastatingly so. He found out, for instance, that something like over 90% of his Yale peers had been raised by their two biological parents.
90%.
Yeah, they had this incredible structural stability almost as a default, which maybe allowed them the luxury of theorizing about why that structure wasn't important or was somehow oppressive.
And the prime example he uses is around family structure itself.
Exactly. Affluent classmates might casually state that monogamy is outdated, or that family structure doesn't really matter for kids, or that marriage is a patriarchal institution. Saying these things signals sophistication, open-mindedness. They reap the status reward. But who pays the price when these ideas trickle down and become more widely accepted, especially among those without the resources to mitigate the fallout? It's often the working class, the less affluent.
Look at the stats cited again.
Right. In 1960, the source says about 95% of both affluent and working class kids lived with two biological parents. Pretty similar.
Okay.
By 2005, the affluent rate was still high, around 85%, but the working class, it had plummeted to just 30%.
Wow, that divergence is massive.
It's huge. And Henderson's argument is that the promotion of ideas dismissing family stability, often by a protected elite who secretly ensure their own kids have stable structures, actively undermines the social foundation needed for less affluent communities to thrive. It's a luxury belief that arguably weaponizes nurture failure against the vulnerable.
The defund the police movement is cited as another example of this kind of externalized cost, right?
It fits the pattern, yeah. The argument is that the strongest theoretical support for defunding often came from wealthier individuals living in safe, well-patrolled neighborhoods, the elite bubbles. Supporting it felt virtuous, signaled progressive values.
Yeah.
While polling consistently showed that the poorest Americans, particularly minority communities who are disproportionately the victims of violent crime and often live with the consequences of reduced police presence, they were generally the least supportive of broad defunding measures.
So the elite gets the good feeling.
The elite gets the virtuous feeling, the status points. The vulnerable potentially bear the cost in increased chaos and instability when that environmental break is weakened or removed.
And maybe the most insidious part of this, Henderson suggests, is the redefinition of harm itself.
Yeah, this really struck him. Coming from a background of actual visceral trauma, physical abuse, neglect, constant instability in foster care, he was genuinely shocked when classmates at Yale would claim that, say, a challenging email or someone wearing a costume deemed cultural appropriation inflicted real pain or even violence.
It's a different category of experience entirely.
Completely. And the argument is that creating these more abstract, theoretical, maybe status-related harms, it inadvertently cheapens the meaning of true, tangible suffering, like poverty, addiction, violence, neglect, the kind Henderson witnessed daily. By redefining words like violence or harm to include hurt feelings or ideological disagreements, the intellectual class might validate their own anxieties, but they risk trivializing the profound suffering of those living outside their protected sphere.
And this tendency, this potential for ideology to warp our view of reality, it's not confined to one side of the political spectrum, is it? The source material points fingers in both directions.
Absolutely not. It's an equal opportunity problem. Hooven, for instance, described experiencing this intellectual resistance to biological reality within science and academia itself. She talks about the pushback against discussing potential biological differences between the sexes, even when the data is robust. There's often this fear, maybe understandable but ultimately unscientific, that even acknowledging biological differences might somehow harm the political project of gender equality.
So denying nature becomes a kind of luxury belief for the intellectual class.
You could see it that way. It's the belief that our preferred ideology, our social goals, can or should override objective biological reality, that the map is more important than the territory.
And the debate around transgender women competing in women's sports is presented as a really clear case study of this clash.
It is. The luxury belief in this view is that biology is largely irrelevant, or that self-identification trumps biology entirely, and maybe that a period of testosterone suppression completely negates any prior biological advantage gained during male puberty.
But the cost.
The cost, critics argue, is paid directly by female athletes who find themselves competing against individuals who retain significant physiological advantages due to those irreversible brick-like effects of male development.
Things like bone density, lung capacity.
Exactly. Bone density, heart size, muscle mass, leverage. things that T suppression later in life doesn't fully undo. The argument is that ignoring this biological base rate, the consistent 10–12% performance gap typically seen between elite male and female athletes across most sports, it undermines the very category of women's sports. Sound human judgment has to grapple with reality, even when that reality is complex or politically uncomfortable.
Okay, so that's one side. But the source material is clear that the right has its own version of ideological failure, often stemming from ignoring nurture or complexity.
Definitely. Marlene Zuk's term paleofantasy comes up again. There's often this promotion of a very rigid, monolithic script about human nature, particularly masculinity.
The alpha male obsession.
That's a big part of it, this simplistic worship of a singular, hyper-aggressive alpha ideal. It's that more T equals better, thinking we talked about earlier, and completely ignores crucial concepts like the dose-dependency mental model.
Right. More is not always better.
Often, it's actively maladaptive. It's self-destructive. And the source offers this brilliant biological takedown of the simplistic alpha narrative using Hooven's lizard experiment.
Ah, the jacked up lizards. Tell us about that.
So, scientists gave some male lizards testosterone implants, created these super aggressive lizards that drastically increased their territory patrols, attacked rivals
See,
constantly.
they look like the ultimate alphas, right? Dominating everyone.
On the surface, yes, that's the first-order effect. But the end-order effect, the longer-term consequence, it was ruin.
Ruin? How?
They burned through their energy reserves early and unwisely, constantly fighting, defending every inch. And the result, half of these Super T lizards died before mating season even arrived.
Wow. And the less aggressive ones.
The betas, the ones with normal T levels who were less aggressive, conserved their energy. They survived and got to mate.
So the alpha strategy was actually a losing strategy in the long run?
In that context, yes. It's a crucial lesson in biological trade-offs. The simplistic alpha script completely misses this. It ignores dose dependency, it ignores context, it ignores receptor sensitivity.
It ignores complexity and leads to poor judgment, whether you're a lizard or maybe an investor betting everything on one overly aggressive, high-burn strategy.
Precisely. And the right can also fail by ignoring the nurture side, especially the internal environment. Sometimes there's this tendency to dismiss mental health struggles, for instance, as just a lack of moral fiber or willpower.
Which completely ignores.
It completely ignores the deep-seated impact of poor nurture, of trauma, of growing up in that cage of chaos we discussed with Henderson. His story is the ultimate counterexample. His greatest act of agency wasn't just toughing it out, it was finding the courage to seek help, to go to therapy, to actively work on dismantling that internal cage built by years of damaging experiences. Acknowledging the power of nurture, good and bad, is essential.
So agency. Agency seems to be the final piece here. And Henderson's story, and Hari's work too, they point towards an antidote to this fractured reality, this disconnect from nature and nurture. And it's surprisingly simple, isn't it?
It is almost counterculturally simple in our tech-saturated world. Long-form reading.
Reading.
Yeah. Hari calls it weight training for focus in a world that constantly fragments our attention. And maybe even more importantly, he calls it an empathy gym.
An empathy gym.
Especially reading fiction. It provides a kind of social simulation. It trains your brain to inhabit other minds, to understand complex motivations, to see the world from perspectives radically different from your own. It builds the capacity to understand the other.
And this skill, this capacity, it's declining.
Critically so, it seems. The source cites data showing a dramatic fall in the proportion of Americans reading for pleasure, something like a 40% drop just for men between 2004 and 2017.
40%. That's staggering.
It is. And the worry is that our constant diet of screen-based information trains us to scan and skim. That fragmented, shallow attention becomes our default mode, making deep reading and deep thinking harder.
But for Henderson, reading was more than just focus training.
It was a lifeline. He describes how reading helped him construct makeshift role models from characters in books. Unlike the chaotic, unreliable adults in his actual life, these literary figures wouldn't disappear on him.
Wow.
It was his private intervention, a structured, reliable way to build a better schema of the world, of relationships, of stable character, using his own deliberate agency to overcome that profound nurture failure. He was using books to replace the maladaptive behavioral bricks with more stable, constructive ones.
So let's try to synthesize all this. What does it really mean for making better decisions today, especially in this age of AI where everything feels accelerated?
Well, I think the core message is that even as technology gets incredibly good at certain things, pattern matching, automation, processing vast amounts of data, Human judgment remains our enduring, maybe our most crucial edge,
Specifically, our ability to.
our ability to reason, to question the model itself, to apply these timeless principles like the interplay of nature and nurture to the outputs we get.
Because AI can amplify insight.
Hugely. It can give us base rates, correlations we'd never spot incredibly quickly. But, and this is the critical but, it can also drastically amplify error if the underlying human schema, the assumptions we feed into it, are flawed.
Like a luxury belief baked into the algorithm.
Exactly. If our starting point is detached from reality, AI just helps us get to the wrong answer faster and maybe more confidently. That's why we need that intellectual rigor, that humility about our own biases and models.
So if there's one thing, just one key takeaway people should remember from this deep dive, drawing from Poor Ash's almanac, what would it be?
I think if you remember one thing is that reality is the ultimate arbiter, and your belief system must fit the complex reality of nature and nurture, not the other way around.
Don't bend the map to fit your desires. Make sure your map actually reflects the territory.
That's the ultimate safeguard. Against ideological capture, against operational failure. And maybe as a practical step, we'd encourage you, the listener, just to notice. Notice the next time you, or maybe an algorithm you're using, presents a conclusion based on a really rigid model.
Ask yourself, is this model denying biological base rates? Is it ignoring the power of environment and agency? Or is it maybe assuming human agency can overcome anything, regardless of the environmental cage?
Before you trust any output, whether it's coming from your own brain or from a sophisticated algorithm, just pause and ask, which model or perhaps which luxury belief might be shaping this answer? And what could be the real-world, maybe externalized cost of that belief if it's wrong?
That's a powerful question to keep in mind. You can find the full write-up on this, including references to all the books we mentioned, like Hooven's, Henderson's, Harry's, and Wynn's, plus more guided learning journeys over at Poor Ash's Almanac from Ask Aladdin Capital.
And please join us next time as we explore another mental model designed to sharpen judgment and, crucially, to help keep human wisdom firmly at the center of a world that's being increasingly shaped by AI.